I think rules are really stupid and the world is way more complex and we should always be questioning everything and pushing every boundary that we can.
What is up, certified homies? Welcome to another episode of From A to B. We have Shiva, and I'm joined by repeat guest, Erin. All she does is win Weigel. Certified homie, of course, y'all know that she's absolutely the certified homie, but she has went through the work of creating a new book. So author of new book, Design for Impact, which someone smarter than her has said it's a Bible for all things experimentation. I don't know who said that, but whoever said that probably sounds like a super smart person.
Clearly a genius said that.
It was me. I said
I know, I trust you. You're so smart.
For the guests who are like, what is this? This is a strange thing. It's me. I'm pumping myself as a smart person. Anyway, it was so much fun to see you walking through this and all the snuggies and all of the late nights that you were in. It's obvious you put a shit ton of effort into it. I'll drop a link in the description for anyone to go purchase it. But yeah, I'm sure you're finally like a weight off my shoulders.
Yeah, I did my best and I'm kind of lost if I'm honest. Like a colleague of mine asked me what I did this weekend and I was just like, I don't know. Like I cleaned. I cleaned the house. And then I was like, I took my daughter to the trampoline, because I was just like, what do people do on the weekends when they're not writing a whole book? So I panicked a little bit and I was like, let's go to the trampoline. So yeah.
You finally get to enjoy and reap the rewards. But yeah, everyone go take a look at the book, go download it, go buy it. It's great. I'm looking forward to my signed copy.
Oh, yeah, totally. I'll mail that to you ASAP for sure. Did you get my stickers yet? I mailed you stickers.
I haven't got them yet, okay. But
there might be a delay.
Timing.
Yeah, exactly. It's coming from Europe, the whole way to Texas. They're probably stopped at customs or something, and you might have to pay $20 just to import fees or something, but it's totally worth it. They're worth it. Trust me.
$20 import fees for $2 stickers.
Exactly.
Math.
Yes, that's how it works.
So the topic for today's episode is trying to understand how to actually utilize UX patterns, UX principles, and quote unquote best practices a little bit more. The reason I want to talk about this is I think most people, I don't want to say most, my feed is riddled with people who are just extrapolating these things to the dumbest logic. Like, oh, I saw this one UX pattern or I know this one UX principle. Therefore, I can design all these things, never test it. You don't ever have to test it because it's a pattern, it's a principle, it's this, it's that. My issue with it as a whole is while the logic may be sound up front, I think most people just extrapolate them wrongly. Before we get into that, what would you define as a UX principle? Okay,
so for a UX principle, I think of a guiding ethos behind how you actually approach your work. So it's less about tactics and actually the hands-on work and more about the spirit that you bring to it. And I think the most popular ones are the ones that Dieter Rams had talked about, the 10 principles of good design, which a lot of people...
Wait, what's Dieter Rams?
Dieter Rams? You don't know who Dieter Rams is? He's a design god.
Oh, I thought, of course I know, but you should let the listeners know who they are in case they don't know, because I definitely know.
Okay, yes, of course you know who Dieter Rams is. I'm probably saying his name. Yes. He's German, so it's probably Dieter Rams. That's totally Dieter Rams. So he's a German design god, but he was really well known. And he had 10 principles of good design. It's what he's known for. So it's good design is innovative, good design makes a product useful, good design is aesthetic, it makes a product understandable, is unobtrusive, honest, long-lasting, is thorough down to the last detail. So there's a whole list of these things. And it's kind of like the 10 commandments, but for designers and the stuff that they follow. But then what a lot of design teams tend to do is then they craft their own design principles that are more contextual to their specific situation to say good design is XYZ, good design is blah, 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 which takes into consideration the business context or their customers' specific needs or whatever. So those are what I consider to be principles, a guiding ethos. Is that clear?
I think that makes sense. I think I'd also add other things like some of the Nielsen Norman UX principles. So things like, I don't know, less is better, generally speaking. You don't want to have a bunch of different forms. Let's say form fields, for example. That's one of those things that as an idea, you don't want users to fill out 10,000 form fields to buy something. You need less than that. I have challenges with that type of principle, and we can get into that a little bit later. But that's maybe another example. Maybe something like, I don't know, like buttons need to be tappable on a mobile screen, that you have to make sure you right size it according to the finger size. You need to be accessible. And I guess that's maybe adjacent to UX principles. Maybe that's more accessibility.
I would call those more like guidelines. And then you have patterns, right? So you have like documentation or guidelines that you should follow when you're using specific like UX patterns. So when you're talking about Nielsen Norman Group, I feel like they do a lot of like general research to understand how well people understand certain mental models, or what, quote, design patterns are easiest for people to navigate and get through. A, quote, design pattern that people get used to is, for example, the floating action button on like the bottom right-hand corner of an Android device, for example. Or another design pattern that's common is like having a header with a logo on the top left-hand corner. I'd consider that to be like a design pattern that a lot of people follow, because that's where people look for things. Like if you're on an Android device and you're looking for the main action, it's probably in a floating action button on the bottom right-hand corner. If you try to navigate back, it's usually at the top left-hand corner. So those are kind of like what I would call design patterns. And then there's a whole bunch of other types of design patterns that they do, or that they've investigated. Things like, how do you upload a file or upload an avatar to your profile or something like that? So what does that particular piece of UI look like, and how do people interact with it? Then there's like mental models and stuff as well too, that are like multiple patterns that fit together.
Some of these things are based in psychology, right? Like the psychology of how users interact with websites. But to your point, some of it's also based on maybe some trendsetters doing things the way that they do it, and everyone's used to it being a specific way. That's where kind of patterns go in. That if, for example, add to cart is common vernacular across the board, and if you said like put in your pocket as like the like CTA text, right? That's a breakage of a pattern that perhaps in some cases might actually make contextual sense, but it breaks the pattern that people are quote unquote used to, because everyone basically copies everyone else.
Yeah, that's a good example of that. You do also have to break these sort of patterns, like the baseline patterns that people typically start from, or else there's no innovation that ever happens. So like if you think about how the BlackBerry existed, and there was like an actual keyboard where you used your fingers and then you like tapped on things, and then Apple came along and they're like, actually, I don't think we need keys anymore. So if they wouldn't have intentionally broken that pattern of having physical keys on a keyboard, then we would have never had the new pattern, which is now not having a keyboard and having more of like a screen that you interact with.
Yeah, so I guess your summary here is patterns are anti-innovation.
They can be. I hate to say like they are, but I think they can be anti-innovation. And I think that's also okay, right? Depending on what you're trying to do with it. Like if your goal is just to make something work, that's fine. Like to have it be dead easy to understand and to make things as simple for people as possible. I always like to stick as close to people's current mental models as possible, and then know when I'm innovating intentionally to break a pattern to see if I can actually improve upon it based on whatever context I'm in.
Totally. And I think that's the case, especially if you're like smaller businesses, or you're just pulling a Shopify template off the shelf because you have like $10,000 of investor money in your bank account. You're probably not spending that money to put it in your pocket as a CTA and spending a bunch of brand money and hours. Like you're just trying to move units. You're trying to build a business. So there are times and places to be innovative. Obviously, companies like Apple, Microsoft, these big companies can push the charge. But I do think it can be dangerous to exclusively pattern and copy what everyone else is doing versus taking steps to say, what can work for us? What are ways we could differentiate? Because if your whole site is just a pattern of everyone else, your product better be badass and totally unique in the space or something else. Because if you're just, I don't know, I hate to say this, but if you're just a copycat of like Amazon's website, you're going to lose to Amazon every time, unless your product is so far beyond.
That's true. I think there's like a distinction between when you're building base and sticking close to patterns as much as possible versus like when you're trying to improve upon what's already there. In the spirit of experimentation too, you always have to assume that there's something better, but you're always highly skeptical that whatever it is that you've done is actually better. So it's like this weird tension between like, okay, what we have is like pure vanilla bland baseline, right? And then we think we can make it better by doing XYZ thing. Maybe that means breaking a pattern, and maybe that means adhering more closely to a pattern. And then you're super skeptical of it until you've actually proven that whatever you've put in place is better than what's currently there. You should always be in the constant thing of testing things. So you should never be satisfied. Like, even if you are using a pattern, you should always be skeptical and say, well, did I implement, is this pattern the right thing for this specific context? Is it the right thing for my business? Is it the right thing for my users? Did I implement it correctly? You know, there's so many moving parts to implementing a design pattern effectively that you can mess it up in so many different ways. So I hesitate to say that copying best practices or a specific design pattern is the way to go. You should always be skeptical.
The last thing is, what is a best practice? It's basically a pattern suitable for widespread adoption. That's probably the evolution where, in many cases, people assume wrongly the definition of that best practice is suitable for widespread adoption. And I think part of the way is they assume psychology principles are the means that will get you towards that widespread adoption. So when they say, like, you need to simplify your website as a psychology principle, simple is better than complex. That's fair. And then what they do is, all right, make it simple. And then they'll follow some bullshit best practice based on that principle. And then they'll extrapolate that to say, I don't have to test this because I followed a UX principle. And that's where I think a lot of people fail. To your point, test everything. Of course, you should be testing it.
But there's too much human judgment going on in between. Here is a best practice, and here's a person's interpretation of what simple is. Because I guarantee you, even the common definition of what simple is to, let's say, a user in China, for example, versus a designer who has a specific aesthetic and they determine what simple is. Maybe they're super minimalist, or your average user. So like, everybody's definition of simple is so wildly different that I even feel like simple is better or less is more is just total nonsense. It's just bullshit, in my opinion, as well too. I think there's a great Milton Glaser quote that's in my book, actually, where just enough is more. And usually designers have this horrible tendency to strip back and hide things in their UI because they want to make it look tidy or not intimidating or whatever. And they'll think it looks great and it feels good to them. But then when a user comes there, they have absolutely no idea what to do because they don't know where to look for stuff where the designers have hidden it. So in that case, for them, what a designer considers to be simple, an average user says, this is terrible. This is so difficult to use. And it's the opposite of simple, becomes very difficult because they've hidden everything, you know? So simple is like such a loaded term.
You're right. There is a human layer of these principles that's being extrapolated. To your point, simple is totally subjective. And people are taking simple and trying to spin it into an objective framework, when the reality is it's absolutely subjective. That, you know, I was gonna tell you, my mom probably can't use most websites, and she's a smart person. She was a computer science major back in the day, but she would much rather go into a store and buy things rather than buy something online. What is simple to us as uber nerds is absolutely not simple to her using a website. If I told her to like right click inspect element, she would think I'm like a hacker man. Right?
Yeah, totally get it. Humans have this tendency to want to generalize things that are absolutely not generalizable. We want to put things into buckets and we want to say, this is definitely the way to go because it's worked in XYZ cases. It's going to definitely work for this particular case too. Like, we seek patterns even where there are none. That's why we test, because we think that these things are generalizable, or we have some evidence, which is probably from confirmation bias most of the time anyways, because I've tested things to consider to be best practice and they've not done well because maybe the context was wrong or the implementation was messed up or whatever. But yeah, we try to generalize things that are not generalizable at all. So
I'm going to pull out this quote. We seek patterns where they don't exist. And that's kind of an interesting human nature thing. People crave simplicity. And I think that's where UX principles helps guide in theory, right? Like, in theory, it helps you like, oh, okay, this is the way humans react. So we could take these principles and manipulate people to buy.
Yeah, but it's also, we should question everything, right? I think people also like to think in concrete, like absolutes as well, where what the example of, hey, I've seen this thing happen a couple of times, so I'm going to draw like a linear conclusion, like if this, then that all the time because I've observed it. Because it makes us feel comfortable if their things are predictable. So that's a very linear way of thinking. It's a very concrete way of thinking. when you actually start testing everything and you really examine how the world works, you realize that there are so many variables at play that things are really not nearly as predictable as we think they are, and things are not nearly as reliable as we want them to be, which is why companies test, or that's why like Amazon and Meta and Booking test all those things, because they've learned through testing that if you just do what everybody else is doing, believing in something because somebody said it was true, or holding on to a belief because there's comfort in it, it comforts our brains to think we've done the right thing, then we're never going to learn anything. We're never actually going to make anything better. So it's just, I feel like it's a different way of thinking entirely. It's to just blow best practices out of the window and be suspicious of everything and just open to trying everything.
So I had Talia on a previous episode, and what we went through, and I asked her this challenging question off the cuff, which is like, are best practices anti-personalization? Because best practices aim to basically manipulate the whole and create rules for the whole, boil the ocean, versus personalization goes down to a unique one-to-one user. In that same vein, let me ask you this. Does the idea that patterns exist counter to the necessity of research? Meaning, when people are so aggressively looking for patterns in perhaps things where they don't exist, those folks are almost inherently saying, we don't need research because we're trying to meta-analyze all of these patterns of other things that have been tested. In my eyes, UX principles might be an interesting starting point. Well, where people generalize it way too far is like, no need for research, no need for testing. It's proven, it's a principle, it's that. You don't have to test it. As experimenters, obviously you and I are both very heavy and test everything, right? Why would you talk about patterns if you're an experimentation evangelist? It seems counter to the mission.
Okay, so you got to start somewhere, man, right? We would be totally rendered, I don't know, just paralyzed. We would not be able to move or like take one step forward if we weren't making some kind of an assumption, right? Assumptions help us get the work off of the ground. An assumption is a belief that you have that doesn't require proof for you to believe it, right? But as soon as we make an assumption to take one step forward, then we have to start gathering proof or trying to either to validate or invalidate whatever assumption is that we've made to get things started. And that's where I always like to use the model of the hierarchy of evidence, where we say, okay, I'm going to make an assumption based on whatever weak evidence I might have from somebody else's research in a different industry, which is why I go to the Nielsen-Norman group. I do think a lot of qualitative research studies like that are a great place to start, but it's an assumption. It's still an assumption because you don't have proof specific to your situation. So as you're designing something or looking to improve it, what you're always trying to do is get higher quality evidence that's more specific to your context and your customers to see if that same idea or concept is applicable to your situation. That's where maybe people stop. They say, oh, somebody else has proven this for their thing, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just going to believe that because it's easy, and maybe people are lazy. I don't know. But like, we always need to be seeking that higher quality evidence. You need to start somewhere. And I think starting with somebody else's research is better than just pulling things out of your ass, as far as I'm concerned. So I'd rather start with the Nielsen-Norman group stuff, but I'd never stop there. I'd always say, how do I get something of higher quality, like a randomized controlled experiment, for example, and more specific to my context?
When we think about the hierarchy of evidence, at the very bottom is these best practices, in my opinion. It's these patterns, it's these UX principles, it's things that have been quote unquote proven for other folks. And it might be something to adopt if you literally have nothing else. But I'll say the ceiling is probably very, very low. And the quality that, like, you have to start somewhere, I agree. But I think it's a sign of a low maturity company if the majority of your decisions is based on like patterns and principles and not actually aggressively testing out the things you're doing and conducting research to figure out what needs to be done moving forward. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. Because again, even if the pattern or the whatever principle it is you're following is completely applicable to your specific situation, you somehow nailed it right on the head, you still could have totally messed up the implementation. Do you know what I mean? Like, you could have picked the wrong color. You could have had a JavaScript error that you wouldn't have anticipated. You could have forgot to test it in dark mode, for example. Like, there are so many ways that you can mess up the implementation of a best practice. Yeah, you just should not make that a conclusion. I think there's too many variables.
This is something I've been chewing on for quite a bit. A lot of people will say, like, it's a proven practice. with best practices or whatever, and it's been tested across a bunch of things. So someone will adopt it or like test it out and say, I tested this best practice, it worked for me, without conducting any research. And in my eyes, it's hilariously terrible because that is correlation rather than causation of the pattern. Does that make sense?
Kind of. Can you explain?
So let me rephrase it. So what I mean is we assume a best practice, let's say sticky CTA, is suitable for widespread adoption across a bunch of sites. And then me as a junior CRO come in and says, oh, I don't have any research, I don't have any data, but this is a best practice. So I'm gonna test it out. And even if it wins, it's still correlation of the pattern being suitable for widespread adoption versus causation that this is in fact suitable for widespread adoption.
If you have evidence, let's say somebody else tested it, or you've seen it in like a blog somewhere that it worked for other people, that's like a
quote unquote evidence.
Yes, evidence, right? For somebody else's situation, you could say that could be a really interesting idea. We can test it out. And then maybe it also worked in your specific situation. I still don't believe that it's generalizable. I still think that you should be only able to say it worked in these specific contexts. And then there's even still a certain amount of uncertainty because there's always false positives, right? It's okay to say that's an interesting concept. I'm going to see if it works in my particular situation, but then I would not just willy-nilly implement it without testing it and assume that it's going to work, for example, you know?
Where so many people lose me is like people who project themselves as like mature experimentation programs, or people who talk themselves as like, we're big into testing all this stuff. And then what they're doing is like, you know, I don't want to call out specific agencies, but I'll say like there's people who are like, we have a repository of tests that have worked for other clients, so we'll pull that in and you could test that. And I'm like, what you're doing is optimizing for scale and like, dude, conduct your own research on those users. Why are you spending any amount of time doing that rather than conducting the research? And again, if, for example, you approach these patterns, these principles from a solution perspective where you say, I have a swipe file of interesting ways to solve for a problem, I love it. I think that's a fantastic use case. But so many times it's like, we're going to project the problem that one company faced to these other companies. And it's like, you're right, it's just lazy. It's people are just, I think it's maybe agencies being perversely incentivized for scale rather than actually being, I'd say, personalizing your experimentation program to each client.
I feel like there's maybe a balance to strike. You know what I'm saying? When you take these like swipe files or blindly say like, oh, hey, I'm gonna, you know, implement sticky CTAs, yada, yada, yada. It's okay to have quick and dirty ideas just to get some tests off of the ground, right? However, then you're not actually being really customer focused and you're not providing the company that you're working for with deep learnings about their customers and then solving the real problems that could drive even more impact. Then you're not really focusing on the customers and the problems that they're experiencing with the product. So I feel like there's a balance to strike there. And I typically think the balance is like 60-40, you know, like there's some quick things. I know that, for example, I read somewhere about like web typography and how you should always have like a minimum of 16 pixels, yada, yada, yada. But this was like back in the day when I was just a wee child learning the internet. But it had to do with like on-screen legibility and mobile devices and all that and how type scaled. So having a baseline type set at like 16 pixels was best practice. And I tested it in some email stuff and boom, it was super successful. But then when I went to test it on some other things in certain contexts, it was not successful because the context was completely different, because when I made that type larger, it pushed more important things down the screen. So again, it comes down to what context in which are you actually implementing these concepts, and does that actually make it better or worse relative to everything else that's around it. And again, I don't think people consider all of the variables that are actually there when you blindly implement certain best practices, like font size must be no larger than 16 pixels, because nope, I've seen that have a really bad impact if you're pushing stuff that's really important out of the screen.
So you're highlighting context and adoption of these principles into different means.
Yep.
Mediums, pages, stuff like that. Totally aligned. I do wonder if, you know, we take a step back and some of these best practices are principles right?
How is it? I'm gonna interrupt you. How are you defining principle? Because I think we're talking about them in two different ways.
I'm more just talking about like the idea of, let's just say, I guess I'm talking more of like the Nielsen Norman type. These are guidelines.
Okay.
These are things to generally follow.
Right.
I think it's a layer more tactical beyond the German guys
Dieter
like
Rams.
make things innovative.
Yeah.
What?
The Dieter Rams.
The German guy is
German
just
guy.
going to be how I pronounce that, because I suck at names.
German names
So
specifically.
it's a layer tactical. As you move down the scale of a let's just say a guideline. I think what he provided was guidelines, right? It's keep things innovative, keep things simple. That's fine. It's so generic that it generally makes sense. And you could adopt that for everyone, generally speaking. But as you start moving down the scale of more tactical execution, so let's say the intermediate, I would say, is principles or patterns, be it like, I don't know, readability of fonts and less steps is generally better. That's when you start to get into issues with generalizability, because you're getting closer and closer to tactical execution. And then you get to that far end of, I'd say, best practices, quote unquote, when you get to the idea of like sticky CTA equals best practice, hero image equals best practice, carousel equals not best practice. You're getting so tactical in the layers of execution. That's where you're totally wrong. I'll just take a hard stance and say you're totally wrong, because you're extrapolating the principle way down to the tactic level, ignoring all kinds of nuance.
Yeah, but I would also even bring it back up to the other end, and I would often argue with whatever principles people start with too. Like, I don't know, I was thinking what you just said, like good design is innovative. So that's one person's very specific opinion. And good design, is just enough. I like that one. It's just enough because it's open to discovery about what just enough is. But where good design is simple, it sounds more concrete in some particular way. So I would even disagree with good design.
Are you just arguing that all rules are bullshit?
Yeah,
and
I
we
hate
should just
rules.
do whatever we want?
Yeah, I think rules are really stupid and the world is way more complex and we should always be questioning everything and pushing every boundary that we can. I'm a bit of a rebel in that way. Because honestly, like when you think about the Dieter Rams, like good design is innovative, sometimes good design is just not innovative. Sometimes it works exactly how people expect it to, like with your mom and the websites or whatever. Like maybe it's okay for it to follow her mental model of how she would check out at a shopping center or whatever, like follow whatever mental models that she has in her head that would help anchor her to that. Is that innovative? Some people would argue not, but does it help her use the internet better? Sure. Does that mean it's bad design? No. I would even call that good design. Meeting the needs of your users where they are, I think, is a better design principle than being innovative for innovative sake, if that makes sense. And same thing with simplicity too. Like I would opt for more, even if it's visually slightly more cluttered, if that means that somebody can accomplish their task faster and easier. But I'm a weird designer, so maybe you shouldn't listen to me, but also listen to me.
I kind of had an epiphany here.
What's that?
I think ultimately what you're saying is good design is the users telling you it's good design. It's not on some designer telling you this is a principle, this is a pattern, this is a guideline.
Yes.
Which ultimately means your users have to be the ones telling you,
yes,
this works, whether it's metrics, conversion metrics, user research.
Feedback.
I think this is the fault of these patterns. This is the fault of best practices. You're assuming that good is on someone else telling you rather than your actual users coming to the site.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why there's a certain amount of feedback specific to the people that you're serving that you need to gather, as opposed to assuming that somebody else's good experience is the same good experience that your customers would have on your product or whatever. It goes back to the specificity thing, right? Remember how I said we like to generalize things, but good design for one person does not necessarily translate to a good design to somebody else who's using that thing if their mental model or what they expect is entirely different.
I think it's a good point now to basically say, what are the best ways to take principles, guidelines, UX psychology, whatever. There's a mishmash of things that people hear on the internet, whether it's swipe files, test out of one, best practices. If you had to summarize, Erin, what is your way of using those? So it's not saying we ignore it. I don't think any of us is saying ignore it, never use it ever. We've explored maybe the faults of extrapolation. So where can we intelligently take these things and say, here's how to use it intelligently, smartly, and maybe some pitfalls as you get through them.
I mean, I use them as inspiration sometimes, like reading the Nielsen-Norman group reports of saying, this is a good pattern for file uploads or whatever. I would test it. I would say, this is a decent assumption starting point. But now I'm going to look for even more higher quality evidence, more specific to my situation, to see if this is actually the best way for me to go or not. And sometimes you can't get that higher quality evidence because you might not have enough sample size or the impact isn't large enough to detect, in which case then I'd have to settle for the highest quality evidence that I have available to, which might be somebody else's research or my qualitative research. But I think they're good for inspiration as long as you don't look at them as like the end-all be-all answers of things. You always have to test them because, like I said, you could mess up the implementation. It might not be right for your specific customers. They're just ideas. I think people like those best practices because they can't come up with their own ideas. A lot of people have a really hard time imagining different ways of people doing things. So they need to look at what other people are doing to figure out what they could or should test. And I think that's why a lot of people, I could just be making this up entirely, I could be wrong, but I did notice that a lot of people do struggle to come up with ideas. It takes a certain type of brain to even think, oh, what if I, made the button look like this, or had this type of feedback, or put an icon over here, or moved it over there based on an observation that they had. I feel like people lean on them because they can't necessarily imagine anything different or think for themselves in a different way. What do you think of that? Or is that just like ridiculous?
Agreed. I've always seen best practices and principles and all this stuff as interesting considerations, perhaps inspiration, but I think exactly to your point, know your limits. Because if you read something and it says like, here's a proven test, it was proven for other people. It wasn't proven for you. So you need to go out and prove it.
I would also say, show me your math. Show me your implementation. I want to see that code. Highly skeptical. That's what you should, if you're actually into experimentation, you should always be extremely skeptical of any result that you ever see.
I agree. Even if it was statistically significant, which to your point, we should have skepticism towards that. Everything's still going to be different. So even if I assume that premise, I still kind of throw it away and say, it's still just an interesting thing.
Because also, people choose their own significance levels, right? Sometimes a lot of people say, okay, I'm going to choose a significance level of 95%. That's the confidence that I want to have, right? But in some cases, people say I'm okay with having less certainty, and my statistical significance level is going to be 80%, which means there's a much higher chance for false positives. So I would even want to know, how are you defining statistically significant, and like, what's your false positive, right? So just show me the math, show me the implementation, show me the code, show me the research, and then maybe I'll believe you.
The last thing I'll say is like, look, at the end of the day, if you have nothing else, you're pulling a Shopify template off the shelf, and you have nothing else, and you need to focus your business on other things, you don't have the resources, it's fine. But know your limits. Know that this is a low ceiling, and if you want to get better, you have to conduct research, you have to test. But if you don't have the resources, that's okay. If as a business you're saying we need to focus on these other things, fine. But if you want your website to be optimized and efficient, and you want to convert more users, you have to invest the time, the money, and the resources, and have adequately powered tests to continue to make better decisions. And you will make better decisions.
Just because you followed a best practice doesn't mean that you've actually made anything better. You've just followed a best practice.
Totally.
That's what you've done.
Especially if you don't even test it. Like, if you just adopt a sticky CTA and you're like, we made it better, you have no fucking idea if you made it better.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah, I agree. Show me the data. I want to see. Where's the evidence?
I'm going to keep on going back to the sticky CTA. It's funny because that's another one of those like Shmuel Patel best practices of like, make it sticky, make everything sticky. It's funny when we talk about nuance, add to that layer of nuance, chatbots, which are another third party, whatever tag, like something that sits on top of your code. And then if you have a sticky CTA and then you have a chatbot on top of that, and like, if you haven't tested it,
you could be making it worse.
Way worse. But it's the best practice, so we adopted it, so it's better.
Clearly. Oh, and if you have like a modal window that pops up, and then like you have a sticky button at the bottom and a sticky floating action button at the bottom right, and then a sticky header.
Well, don't forget the offer pop-up too.
Also. And then it's great. And it's perfect because you followed all of the best practices, and clearly it's better, right? So much better.
I saw a website that literally looked like a vomit of best practices on a page. it looked so fucking ugly. It was so bad.
When so much best becomes the worst.
Yes. I mean, like, yeah, exactly. That's another thing too. These best practices are in isolation, not when you combine them all into like a fucking Frankenstein.
That's what I'm saying.
And
it's contextual.
again, it's all all right.
It's contextual, man.
Shut up, because
it's definitely contextual. So contextual. Yeah. People just don't like to navigate the nuance. I think they prefer to just take other people's ideas.
Why go to the gym when you could just get a gas station diet pill?
Yeah, because it gives you heart problems, right? Aren't they just like filled with caffeine and like hormones that just destroy your heart?
Yeah, but there's a guy wearing a doctor lab coat on the pill bottle. Like,
you're right. That's
I don't know.
Trust signaling. I trust it.
That's another best practice. Trust.
You should just put a doctor.
Bullshit.
Put a doctor on it. I believe it. It's great. Authority.
All right. We got to definitely transition to the next section here before Shiva keeps on going. So, Erin, what is it time for?
Shit you need to know.
All right, let's go. Okay, doke. So this is a little bit of a different twist to how we usually do things. Usually I'll call out some folks who have some really interesting LinkedIn content that y'all got to check out. But instead, we're going to take a listener question.
Ooh.
So this is from the OG certified homie, Sam Barber. He's been here from day one. If you guys want to submit your own listener questions to be featured, go to, and shut up for me using this. I don't have a lot of money paying into this. It's tinyurl.com/ask from A to B. Or just DM me, I don't care. Don't give me shit for tiny URL, Erin. All right, so the question is, how do we best communicate the quote-unquote why behind experiment duration, significance, confidence, power, and when to implement like test winners, losers, whatever, without blowing stakeholders' minds and going down a statistics rabbit hole? Sam, I have a book you might be interested in from someone who on this call has written a book, and spoiler alert, it's not me, that she goes very into detail with a lot of these things. Erin, if you had to kind of summarize, how do you talk to stakeholders about the geeky maths without putting them to sleep? What are some kind of tips and tricks you'd think about to build that trust enough that they understand and trust you, that you know what you're talking about without boring them about all the p-values and alpha bullshit?
Okay, cool. So I feel like executives talk in terms of like risk management. So I think maybe talking to them in terms of like how much confidence you want to be able to have in a decision and the levels of risk that accompanies that. You don't have to necessarily give the numbers and let them know how much uncertainty or how much risk that they're going into, but you can just, say it's like dialing the level of risk you're willing to tolerate up or down. So you can say, if this is a really highly strategic decision that's going to require a lot of continued investment that we cannot get wrong, then we want to be very confident. So the good thing about some of this stat stuff is that it already leans on words like confidence in decisions. So you can say, if you want to be super confident that this is the correct decision, then we need to set a, they don't even need to know that. Then you say, then here's how we do the math, and we'll do the math to make sure that you can be very confident in this decision. Or if it's kind of like, first of all, if it's kind of like a throwaway decision and just like you're trying to make a minor tweak or an optimization, and the risk actually is probably not that high, or it's not going to require continued investment to keep up or whatever, then they could probably deal with a little bit more uncertainty. So then you can say, then we can have a lower level of confidence, and then we can design the experiment to manage risk in that particular way. So I would talk about it in terms of like risk and certainty versus uncertainty, and how much we're willing to invest in things in the future, as opposed to like trying to throw numbers at them. Sometimes numbers can be kind of fun, but I think they just want to know, are we headed in the right direction or not? And usually they want to know how much money, is involved. And maybe just showing the upper bound or the lower bound, and then talking about how much certainty you can have within that range might be useful as well too. So just take away the scary words, and then just talk about certainty and uncertainty and the range in which the likelihood, like the profit and the money and the user experience and the scores, whatever it is that they care about. Talk about certainty, risk management, and all that kind of stuff. Just use words instead of numbers. That's all.
It's kind of funny because, Erin, you are projecting your own best practices for defining and talking about statistics. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
So I think you rightfully called out nuance within these conversations, right? Taking a step back, try and understand your stakeholder a little bit more, or understand the lay of the land of the stakeholders, because I'm interested if you feel the same way. There are some stakeholders who, if you drown them in all of the nerdy stats talk, that's actually really powerful. Because then they're like, I don't know what the fuck he's saying, but he's using a lot of big words, so I trust him, right? But there are some people who are like, no, he's using buzzwords. I don't trust him. And you have to approach that conversation a different way.
Yep.
So in almost a meta conversation around best practices and principles or whatever, you have to like understand your stakeholders and figure out what makes them tick. To your point, risk might be something that the CEO is super interested in because they want to understand the different. They don't want to push out something that's going to affect their bottom line or piss off stakeholders or shareholders or whoever. So maybe you approach that conversation with risk versus maybe that engineer really geeks out on stats and you need to talk to them about stats. Maybe that product owner doesn't give a fuck about either of those things. And you talk about the learnings and you don't even really talk about the statistics. You talk about the interesting things that you're learning and you just put a layer of like, by the way, it's statistically significant so we could trust the results. Or you say it's not statistically significant, so we don't want to interpret the results. And maybe that's simple enough. I think most people, especially myself, like I understand the stats enough, but if you're trying to nerd out with me about alpha values and p-hacking and like, I get it. I just don't want to talk. Like, it's not that super interesting to me. I'll talk about it. It's just I'd rather talk about more fun stuff like insights. And that's where a lot of stakeholders are. They don't give a fuck about the p-values. They care about, to your point, did you make me money? Did you lose me money? Did you save me money?
Did we achieve our goal or not? Yeah. So I think in that particular circumstance, if you're talking about just any stakeholder, I completely agree with you then. Just ask them how much they care. It's like you can have the TLDR version or you can have the nerd version. Which would you prefer?
And like product owners too, when you think about many product owners don't care about literally any of this.
They should really care the most.
I mean, okay, you're right. Also, I wish I had a unicorn, but I don't have a unicorn and that doesn't always exist. You're right. Objectively, you're right. They should care more. But maybe this is even a Trojan horse way. If you simplify it down towards ship decisions, meet them where they're at for right now, and then just start injecting certain insights, talking about things like, oh, if they're like, we're trying to ship this thing and they're like, we can't ship it. Maybe they really wanted to ship it and they can start geeking out on the why and that gets them interested. Or maybe you get to prove value with experimentation and say, we shipped this and made you that much amount of money. Don't you want to know why it won though? Don't you want to make more money? So I agree. You're right. We as in product owners, people should care more. But I live in a lot of worlds where people don't, and it's kind of unfortunate. So sometimes you meet people where they are and say, if they don't care about experimentation, but at least they're supporting your decisions when you say we shouldn't ship this or absolutely we should ship this, take those wins and keep it moving, you know?
That's fair enough. As long as they're listening. But if they're just like ignoring you and then making stupid decisions in spite of it, then, take your hat and go home.
Go to another company where they value you.
Yeah.
It's a sad, depressing truth. Anyway, Erin, I think this will wrap up the episode. We have your book, Design for Impact, available everywhere?
Well, yeah, kind of. Definitely available in the United States. You can get it on my website as well at erindoesthings.com or directly through the publisher. They're called Rosenfeld Media. So you can go to rosenfeldmedia.com. You can buy it there. And then it's in like just different kinds of booksellers depending on where in the world you are. So it's easier to get in some places and harder to get in others.
I've heard through the grapevine it's also an Amazon bestseller.
For some specific categories, why, yes. For like fleeting
Why do we have to get
moments,
into the nuance? No.
I heard
it's an Amazon bestseller.
It's also the best-selling book by somebody named Erin Weigel that has ever been written. Can you believe that? Top-selling book by a woman named Erin Weigel.
See here, this is like the best practice conversation. You're adding nuance to things. No. We don't care about nuance.
No, it's
All
just
we care
a
about is best practices.
Number one bestseller.
It's just
doesn't matter what the categories
number one
are.
bestseller.
For how long, it's the best.
Just like my podcast was the number one podcast.
Ooh.
In like Belarus for like 5 minutes. But it was the number one podcast.
I love that. You're a winner. Belarus is cool. Take that.
I will happily take it. Yes, for sure. All right, Erin, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you guys. Go check out all the cool things she's doing. She posts some really cool stuff. Go check out the things that she does at erindoesthings.com. Buy the book. Erin, 2 times certified homie for coming back on. Appreciate you for jumping on here.
Thanks, Shiva. It's great to see you again.